We're going to talk about opposition in the Soviet Union during Joseph Stalin's regime, which ended up not being too much because of his use of the purge. The consolidation of Joseph Stalin's power would center on a decade of purges of political opponents in the 1930s. Public show trials were held where the outcome was predetermined, but they became powerful propaganda for the state to keep everybody in line and under Stalin's absolute authority. Early purges centered on the expulsion of political opponents from the Communist Party. By expelling them, they would not have any voice within the government. And over time, Stalin's increasing paranoia that others were out to get him would evolve into deportations and ultimately executions. This would follow the consolidation of police power within the Soviet Union, where the law enforcement of the state would be centralized beginning in 1933 and 34. We'd see civilian police, labor and detention camps, what become known as the gulags of the Soviet Union, and border guards, all coming under the control of one central state organization, the new NKVD, that follows the OGPU and becomes the Soviet Union's primary police state agency. The major purges would begin following in 1934 the assassination of Politburo member Sergei Kirov in Leningrad. Now, that murder is under mysterious circumstances, and some even point the finger at Joseph Stalin himself, but it would lead to a number of show trials and executions of those who were accused of killing and not protecting Kirov in Leningrad. In all, 3,000 suspected conspirators were arrested and faced trial and ultimately imprisonment or execution. Thousands of others were deported from Leningrad, and Stalin would fill those vacant positions with his loyalists. This put Joseph Stalin in complete control of the Soviet state bureaucracy. The aftermath of that Kirov assassination would put a target on the back of all party members. Of the nearly 2,000 members that would attend the 1934 Communist Party Congress in Moscow, more than half of them would be executed by 1937. Communist Party, which absolutely controlled the state, was now under the authority of Joseph Stalin. Rising numbers of members within the Communist Party following what is known as the Stalin enrollment would continue to fill the ranks with political opportunists and yes men for Joseph Stalin, who would be concerned, obviously, that they would have the next target on their back, so they towed Stalin's line. Supportive of the purges from these new party members, as they would ultimately gain them their own promotions and a higher position within the party. Now, from 1936 to 1939, political violence in the Soviet Union would increase with what is known as the Great Terror. Stalin believed in a perpetual war against his enemies at home and abroad, and this contributed to mass violence of the state. Thousands of show trials would be held, and military leadership and party leadership were accused of being enemies of the state. Political opponents accused of being Trotskyites and needing elimination. The purge of the Communist Party would follow show trials and execution of thousands of party leaders. Accusations of being spies, sabotaging the Soviet state, even conspiracies to murder Stalin himself. Most would ultimately admit guilt after mental and physical torture. All would be found guilty. And for Joseph Stalin, these show trials, these public confessions of guilt, would offer proof that Stalin's claim that there was this internal war against the state, and it would further strengthen his authority. In 1937, the purges turned on the Soviet military. The Red Army, which was once led by Leon Trotsky himself, was viewed as a threat by Stalin. A supposed conspiracy of a military coup where military officers were coordinating with Germany and Japan was uncovered in show trials and resulted in the execution of many Soviet generals. Within the next months, removal of all political war commissars. These are Communist Party members in charge of the military. 3 out of 5 of the marshals of the Soviet Union, the highest ranking generals within the Soviet army, were purged. Nearly all army commanders and 2/3 of divisional commanders were removed. In all, during this purge of the military during the Great Terror, 35,000 Soviet officers were imprisoned or shot. The Navy and the Air Force faced similar fates. These purges would leave the Soviet military undermanned, inexperienced, poorly led, and certainly not ready for the upcoming Second World War. The purges also targeted the general population. Failure to meet goals of the 5-year plans could result in deportation or execution of the individual workers or even their families. Workers and managers would be accused of industrial sabotage. The vast Gulag network, this network of prison and labor camps throughout the Soviet Union, would fill to house these millions of prisoners. In the end, 1 in 8 Soviet citizens was arrested during the purges. And this created a culture of fear within the state as neighbors ultimately turned on neighbors, and everybody became suspicious of everybody else. Minority regions, the Soviet socialist republics outside of Russia, were also targeted for purges to root out any nationalist sentiments that might grow in those places. Now, following the Second World War, purges would continue in the Soviet Union. The Politburo and the Central Committee of the Communist Party were ended in 1947. In 1949, what was known as the Leningrad Affair led to a purge of party members in the city of Leningrad, the old St. Petersburg, following accusations that that city was being used as a base of operations against Joseph Stalin. In 1953, a supposed doctor's plot where hospital workers, many of them being Jewish in Moscow, were accused of planning the murder of Joseph Stalin. This demonstrates both Stalin's purges, but also the anti-Semitism that existed within the Soviet state under Stalin. Now, Stalin would die of natural causes in 1953. And so this doctor's plot really never resulted in a purge of the Jews of Moscow, as the leaders following Joseph Stalin would call the plot a fabrication, and it would just kind of fizzle. But in all, these purges throughout Joseph Stalin's rule through the 30s and 40s would ultimately lead him to not have much opposition, because real opposition and imagined opposition was all eliminated with these Soviet purges. We'll see you next time.